Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So we're continuing Salem's witch trials, and we're gonna sort of continue right where we left off. We were talking about Mule, and it's still kind of regarding all the jurors and the court of Oyer and Termina and everything that sort of happened in the aftermath. The composition of the jury may have worried Mule as well. The foreman was Captain John Turner, the wealthy merchant who owned the Salem waterfront mansion that would later be called the House of Seven Gables. Turner was the kinsman of Bartholomew Gedney, so he probably did not take too kindly to anyone questioning the actions of the witchcraft judges. Thomas Flint Sr. was a prominent member of the pro-Paris faction in Salem Village and was related to the Putnam family by marriage. His son, Thomas Jr., also served on the jury. Samuel Woodwell's sister-in-law had seen Giles Corey apparition and testified against George Burroughs. Then there was Joseph Eveleth, who had served as a juryman for the court of Oyer and Termina. All four of these men would have been predisposed to look unfavourably on Mule as his efforts to denigrate the witch trials. If the presence of such jurors made Mule nervous, he never showed it. He took the offensive in arguing his case, claiming the truth held forth was actually a religious text and thus shouldn't be debated in a religious court, not a secular one. Therefore, while he did respect the judges, he did say, though, in this case, I do no more value you than I do a jackstraw, which is probably not the best thing to say. Judge Danford then described Mule in terms that might have been reserved for a witch. He warned the jury that Mule had committed horrid wickedness for writing his blasphemous book, and that he had written it intending to overthrow all good in church and commonwealth, which God had planted amongst this people in this province. Mule entered and countered that he had broken no laws, and had not written or caused to be printed anything contrary to sound doctrine and inconsistent to the Holy Scriptures of truth. Furthermore, Mule claimed, rather less heroically, that there was not sufficient proof that he was the author of the book. Yes, it had his name on it, but anyone could have put it there. He actually mocked the court of Oyer and Termina in his defence, saying that his name on the book was no more than the spectre evidence, for his name had been placed there by the printer, just as the devil might use an innocent man's spectre. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of not guilty, much to the shock and displeasure of the judges, who immediately quizzed the panel on how they could have reached such a decision. As he listened, Mule must have thought of Rebecca Nurse, first found innocent, only to have the jury change its verdict when Stoughton sent them to deliberate again, and another judge threatened to indict her a second time. Fortunately for Mule, this time the jury stood its ground. The foreman indicated that, as Mule had suggested, while his name was on the title page, there was insufficient evidence to prove he was the author of the book. They also agreed with Mule that the book should have been judged by a jury of divines, maybe in a religious court. Mule's acquittal may have resulted in part from the fact that, despite appearances, he had some jurors in his corner. John Potter was a member of Lynn's Quaker community and the son-in-law of the Quaker and alleged wizard, Francis Norwood Sr. Samuel Kilham of Wenham was the kinsman of the executed witch Sarah Good. Captain Daniel King had tried to have one of George Burroughs' accusers, Eliza Kaiser, meet with the minister prior to his trial to see if they could work out their differences. When Kaiser refused, King admonished him that Burroughs was a good choice child of God, and that God would clear up his innocency. John Growing's sister-in-law was John Proctor's daughter, and James Holton had signed a petition in support of the Proctors. Joseph Eveleth had signed a second petition for the Proctors. Indeed, Evelyn was one of the 12 witchcraft jurors who would sign an apology that was published by Caliph in 1697. Clearly Evelyn had a change of heart, as had others who had supported, or at least gone along with the witch trials. Regardless of the reasons for their verdict, the jurors' acquittal of Thomas More was a turning point in the history of not only the Salem witch trials, but also American jurisprudence. Before 1692, a Massachusetts jury would have undoubtedly convicted a troublemaking Quaker, an habitual offender who impudently challenged authority. Indeed, had the case been tried under the old Puritan-controlled 1629 charter, John Potter could have not have served on the jury because he was a Quaker. Mill's not guilty verdict, announced in the same courtroom and before some of the same magistrates who had sat in judgment of victims of witchcraft, signals a dramatic change. The case was a landmark victory for freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. The fact that a jury consisting largely of Puritans would do this in Salem, against the clear wishes of the judges, also shows that the tide of popular opinion had turned against the verdicts in the witch trials. Officials may not have been happy, but they recognised this sea change for what it was and did not disturb Moore, let alone charge him. When he published his scathing account of the trial, New England prosecutors, mauled with their own weapons, that was the following year. Perhaps he avoided persecution because this time he was wise enough to have the book published anonymously. Mill's second book stressed the hypocrisy of Puritan authorities, along with the greed of their ministers. He claimed that avarice was the reason courts fine people for premarital sex or for being a Quaker or other dissenter. Puritans seemed to prefer collecting fines to jailing offenders. He then went to discuss the cases of 309 people who had suffered persecution by Puritan authorities, concluding his work with an account of his own persecution and trial. In 1696, there were other signs of regret over the witch trials in Massachusetts, fueled in part by the many difficulties the colony faced. The war with the French and the Native American allies raged on, with no end in sight. Throughout the spring and summer, there were constant rumours of invasion, and settlements in Maine and New Hampshire were harassed by a series of small raids. Then in August, Pemaquid's Fort William, Henry fell to a French fleet, supported by their native allies. The stone fortress had been built at great expense by Governor Phipps, who bragged the fort is sufficient to resist all the Indians in America. Nonetheless, it surrendered after less than a day of fighting. With William Henry reduced to ruins, people feared the French fleet might venture further south, even attacking Boston. Instead, the flotilla turned north to Newfoundland, destroying the English fishing stations and taking possession of the entire island. Newfoundland had been a major commercial partner of Massachusetts, and to lose the trade with these prosperous fishing ports was a major blow to the economy, already burdened by a costly war. Massachusetts retaliated by sending an expedition to attack the French stronghold on the St. John River in Acadia. Commanded by former witchcraft judge John Hathorne, the invasion failed miserably. As Samuel Sewall complained in a letter, the news was nothing but rumours of war and slaughter against us by sea and land. The symbolism of this must have seemed particularly strong. The destruction of a fort built by the former governor during the witchcraft outbreak, and the failures of one witchcraft judge as acting governor and another as commander of the military expedition. Surely God was punishing Massachusetts for its sinful dealings in 1692 and its failure to admit its guilt. There were other ominous signs of God's displeasure with Massachusetts. The colony suffered a famine in the spring of 1696. A killing frost had destroyed most of the previous summer's corn crops. Prices of corn doubled, and unseasonably cold weather delayed the planting of crops and threatened the growing season. By December, food shortages were very severe, and the winter was considered the worst since the English had arrived in Massachusetts. Political uncertainty continued to cause concern. In May, word reached Boston of foreign plots to assassinate the Protestant William of Orange and restore to the throne the exiled Catholic James II. The plots had been foiled, however, and King William called for a day of thanksgiving throughout his kingdom. Although the General Court agreed on such a day, the fall legislative session was marked by strife and division. Meanwhile, Massachusetts waited in anticipation of the arrival of a new governor following the death of Sir William Phips in early 1695. The devout Puritans of Massachusetts saw all of these problems as signs of God's displeasure. Increasingly, they sought the source of this disapproval, and increasingly they turned to the witchcraft trials. Samuel Sewall noted that on August 12, 1696, a neighbour, upon a slight occasion, spoke to me very smartly about the Salem witchcraft. In discourse he said, "If a man should take Beacon Hill on's back, carry it away, and then bring it and set it in place again, he should not make anything of that." The neighbour was clearly thinking of George Burroughs, who had been executed almost exactly 4 years before, on August the 19th, 1692, in part on charges of his supernatural strength. On September the 16th, Reverend Samuel Willard put a public voice to these concerns. Sewall recorded that Willard preached at a general court service, "If God be with us, who can be against us?" The minister then spoke, smartly at last, about the Salem witchcrafts, and that no order had been suffered to come forth by authority to ask God's pardon. Willard criticised authorities for not making a public confession of guilt for the actions on the colony in the trials. The General Court would soon issue a long overdue apology for the witch trials, but the process would add to the political tensions. On December the 2nd, 1696, the House of Representatives passed a bill for a day of fasting and reformation, and went so far as to order 500 copies of the proclamation written by Cotton Mather to be printed. However, the council took offence on several counts. First, the document had been written without their consultation. Second, the focus of the document was not witchcraft. Rather, it was another call for moral reformation, one that described a range of evils, including uncleanness, excessive drinking, vanity of dress, decay of family discipline, fraud, piracy, and even unrighteous discouragement of the magistrates and ministers of the colony. Witchcraft was hidden within the laundry list of concerns. Wicked sorcerers have been practised in the land, and in the late inexplicable storms from the invisible world thereby brought upon us, we were left by the just hand of heaven unto those errors, whereby great hardships were brought upon innocent persons, and we fear guilt incurred, which we have all cause to bewail, with much confusion of the face before the Lord. Mather continued to minimise the sin of witchcraft, and as he had in the wonders of the invisible world. He could not even admit outright guilt for the miscarriage of justice, but had to qualify it by saying, parenthetically, we fear guilt incurred. Moreover, Mather insisted on blaming the outbreak on the wicked sorcerers, white magic, such as fortune-telling and even Mary Sibley's witch cake. Finally, the House had added to Mather's draft on exhortation to the magistrates to do a better job in prosecuting all offenders and to dispense justice equally. As the members of the council were also the justice of the colony, this was an unacceptable slap in the face, another sign of the political tensions in the General Court. The council passed its own version of a proclamation, authored by Samuel Sewall. Eventually, the House and Council would agree on Sewall's draft, with some minor edits. While Mather had buried the witch trials amid a list of sins and that needed forgetfulness and forgiveness, let's say, Sewall focused on the witchcraft, and especially that whatever mistakes, on either hand, had been fallen into, either by the body of this people or any orders of men, referring to the late tragedy raised amongst us by Satan and his instruments, through the awful judgment of God. He would humble us therefore, and pardon all errors of his servants and people that desire to love his, and he atoned to his land. Sewall's wife had miscarried that past spring, and on December the 23rd, their infant daughter, Sarah, died. The next day, as the family mourned, his son recited to him part of Matthew 12. Sewell remarked the seventh verse did awfully bring to mind the Salem tragedy. But if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would have not condemned the guiltless. Sewell's mind was troubled from the misfortunes of that beset his family. Mull's recent trial would have been a very real reminder of the witch trials, and the Quaker's verdict affirmed that he and the other judges had erred in 1692. Sewell was now convinced that God was punishing not only the colony, but him personally, for the execution of innocent victims. Thanks in part to Mull, he now knew something must be done. During the fast day service, Sewell gave Reverend Willard a letter to read to the congregation. Sewell stood before the congregation as the minister read what has come to be known as Sewell's apology. And we do have the apology here, guys. Samuel Sewell, sensible of the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and family, and being sensible that as to the guilt contracted, upon the opening of the late commission of Oyer and Terminer at Salem, to which the order for this day relates, is upon many accounts more concerned than any that he knows of, desires to take blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and especially desiring prayers that God, who had an unlimited authority, would pardon that sin and all other his sins. It was a breathtaking act of courage, piety, and humility for one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the colony to take responsibility for his actions and openly admit what some refused to accept and others had only hinted at. Sewell never seems to have fully forgiven himself for his involvement in the trials. According to family tradition, it was about this time that he began to wear a hair shirt. Sewell would wear this undergarment for the rest of his life. By making such a public apology, Sewell immediately made a serious enemy of William Stoughton, now of course acting governor of the colony. To the day he died in 1701, Stoughton remained firm in his belief that the witchcraft court had acted properly, indeed, and that it had saved the colony by convicting and executing the witches, and apparently he never forgave Sewell. A year later, Stoughton snubbed Sewell when he invited all the other members of the council to a dinner party at his house. Stoughton's high office and his view of the trials probably kept more people from following Sewell's example. The only others who came forward at this time were 12 men who had served on juries during the witch trials. The declaration of regret printed in Caliph's Small Wonders noted their deep sense of and sorrow for our errors in acting on such evidence to the condemning of any person, and do hereby declare that we justly fear that we were sadly deluded and mistaken, for which we are much disquieted and distressed in our minds, and do therefore humbly beg forgiveness. The fast day and the apologies of Sewell and the jurors must have encouraged John Hale to write his modest inquiry into the nature of witchcraft. He discussed the project with Sewell in November 1697 and completed it in 1698. Just 2 years before he died, Hale had occupied a front row seat for the trials, having been one of the first men called in to look at the afflictions of Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. Hale quickly became a fervent supporter of the proceedings, a position that would eventually change when on November 14, 1692, 17-year-old Mary Herrick would accuse Hale's wife, Sarah Noyles Hale. In 1695, Sarah died, and this, along with the fast day and the apologies and perhaps even Mull's trial, which took place less than 2 miles from Hale's home, apparently led the elderly minister to reflect upon the trials. His book offers a first-hand account by a person closely involved in the trials who tried to find out what went wrong. Hale never denied the existence of witches. Indeed, no one in Massachusetts in 1697 would have seriously questioned their existence. Rather, Hale suggested the officials and judges had been so very afraid of the all-too-real threat of witchcraft that they had panicked. Serious errors resulted in the loss of innocent lives. Joining others in comparing the witchcraft to stormy weather, Hale concluded, "Such was the darkness of that day, the tortures and lamentations of the afflicted, and the power of the former precedents, that we walked in the clouds and could not see our way. And we have most cause to be humbled for error on that hand, which cannot be retrieved." Hale did not believe there were any evildoers in Salem. Rather, good and well-intentioned people had made horrible mistakes. To prevent this from happening in the future, Hale rejected the traditional forms of detecting witches. As Salem's town minister, John Higginson, said in his preface to the book, the example of Salem would lead the most learned and pious men to make a further and fuller inquiry into how witches may be discovered, that innocent persons may be preserved, and none but the guilty may suffer. Hale's book, in an attempt to set the record straight and to make amends. Still, he was not as courageous as Sewell or Mull, for he never had an answer for his work. The manuscript was not published until 1702, a year after Stoughton's death and 2 years after Hale himself had passed away. Mill's trial on the fast day led Robert Caliph, a Boston cloth merchant, who had observed some of the witch trials proceedings, to write an account of the trials that would have particularly long-lasting influence. Caliph was a friend of Mill's and had posted a bond for him when he was arrested in writing Truth Held Forth in 1695. An Anglican, Caliph had migrated to New England during the Dominion of New England, a time of religious toleration. By August 1697, Caliph had completed his manuscript. Its publication was delayed until 1700, however. And, well, as his attack on the proceedings in general and Cotton Mather in particular was so scathing, no one in Boston was willing to undertake the printing, which had to be done in London. As the title suggests, More Wonders of the Invisible World took direct aim at Mather and his Wonders of the Invisible World. Since at least 1693, Caliph had been engaged in the ongoing dispute with the Mathers over witchcraft. In September of that year, he had travelled to Salem to observe Cotton Mather's efforts to heal young Margaret Rule, yet another Maine refugee, who was exhibiting signs of affliction similar to what had been seen in Salem the year before. Caliph wrote down an account of what he observed that night. He suggested that Rule was a fraud and implied that Mather had inappropriately rubbed her breast and naked belly in an effort to heal her affliction by means of laying on of hands. Then Caliph circulated his account to friends. Mather became infuriated when he heard this story, accusing Caliph of lying and charging him with slander. The men exchanged a series of angry letters, where it became clear that Caliph had taken liberties in his account in an effort to bait Mather. Amazingly, before Caliph published his book, he first published Cotton Mather's manuscript account of Margaret Rule's afflictions, followed by his exchange of letters with Mathers. After this inflammatory start, Caliph went on to reprint Wonders of the Invisible World, along with his own history of the trials, largely a rebuttal on Mather. Caliph saw the trials as a conspiracy of the ministers and the government. A zeal government by blindness and passion, led by increased Mather, had precipitated us into far greater wickedness, if not witchcrafts, than any have yet been proved against those that suffered. He believed the afflicted girls and their families had been frauds who deliberately made their accusations for personal gain and to harm their enemies. Caliph's anger shows through in the satirical edge in his writing. The book is far from measured and reasoned. Cotton Mather complained bitterly about the vile volume, consisting of an abominable bundle of lies, written to vilify me and render me incapable to glory the Lord Jesus Christ. One can imagine the Mathers' outrage at the accusations that they had conspired with Governor Phipps to manipulate the outbreak, especially considering that Lady Mary Phipps and Maria Mather had been cried out upon. Increase showed his disdain by having a copy of the book burned in Harvard Yard. For all its faults, Caliph's book clearly demonstrated the younger Mather's duplicity in defending the government in Wonders of the Invisible World. Caliph pointed out that when the witch trials began, Mather was one of the ministers who had urged caution in the use of spectral evidence. Yet a year later, He defended the judges for their actions. Essentially, Caliph threw mud at Mather, and by the extension, the witchcraft judges and the governments of Massachusetts. And it contained enough truth to stick. Caliph's work helped expose the cover-up. Cotton Mather and his colleague unwisely responded to Mule and Caliph's confrontational writings, fueling the controversy. In 1699, Mather included a stinging attack at Mule in his 1699 book, The Frontier Wars, Decennium Luctosum. It would soon be reprinted in Magnalia Christi Americana Malta. Crowning accomplishment, a massive 2-volume history of New England published in 1702. Mather was upset that Mole treated the actions of the Indians as justified and criticised Massachusetts for defending itself against native attack. Mather also faulted the Quakers for not censoring Mule. Mainstream Quakers actually did disapprove of Mule's bombastic books. In their faith early days, Quakers had expressed themselves just as confrontationally, but as time passed, Quakerism adopted to be quieter and less martyr-like style. Mule fell from his position of leadership among the Salem Quakers, and in 1699 the Rhode Island Yearly Meeting actually condemned Mule's writing. Still, Mule could not resist one last reply. In 1701 he published a response to Cotton Mather, in which he claimed Mather stifled his pamphlets full of lies and peddled them in taverns and alehouses to make a profit. He criticised Mather's view of the witch trials and said that he was destined for hell because of his friendship with evil against God's people. Mather was a bit more cautious about getting caught up in yet another debate with Cleave after the publication of More Wonders of the Invisible World. 7 of his parishioners are listed as authors of some few remarks on the scandalous book, though the tract was clearly written under the supervision of the Mathers, and Cotton may have actually authored at least some of the text. The pamphlet pointed out the lies Cleave had made about the witchcraft judges and the Mathers. Cleave did not respond to some few remarks, and this was the last of the published arguments between the Mathers and their detractors. However, this does not mean that people had forgotten about either Salem or the controversy. In 1728, Cotton Mather's son Samuel claimed there was a certain disbeliever in witchcraft that wrote against my father's book, but the man is dead, and this book died long before him. That was far from true. Caliph's book was reprinted 5 times between 1796 and 1866. Furthermore, the dispute with Mather was remembered in poetry by John Greenleaf Whittier in his poem Caliph in Boston, 1692. In the 1850 poem, Caliph tells Mather, "Falsehoods which we spurn today were the truths of long ago. Let the dead boughs fall away, fresher shall the living grow." If Samuel Mather was still concerned about the dispute in 1728, the controversy must have been also well remembered by many others, including Caliph's numerous descendants. One of Caliph's great-grandsons was General Joseph Warren, the patriot hero who died at Bunker Hill. Another great-grandson, George Robert Twelves Hughes, was a cobbler, revered in his extreme old age for his participation in the Tea Party in the Boston Massacre, and recently brought to prominence again by historian Alfred Young in his book, The Shoemaker and the Tea Party. He has probably had a low opinion of his wealthy, loyalist cousin, Dr. John Caliph, a grandson of Robert Caliph, who became a Surgeon General and chaplain to the British Army and a leader of the United Empire Loyalists. Caliph's work was in much more demand than the thoughtful and reasoned arguments of Reverend Hale, whose modest inquiry was reprinted only once before the 20th century. Caliph's arguments were picked up by Daniel Neal, an early historian of the trials. An English clergyman, Neal published his History of New England in 1720. Though Neal largely relied on Cotton Mather and his authority, It was Khalif's view of the proceedings that dominated his book. Neil was one of many subsequent writers who adopted Khalif's version of events, making them the dominant history of the trials for 3 centuries. As historian Samuel Eliot Morison famously said, Robert Khalif, who had it in for Cotton Mather, tied a tin can to him after the frenzy was over, and it has rattled and banged through the pages of superficial and popular historians. Faced with a difficult choice, Cotton Mather chose to try and protect the Puritan state by concealing the errors of the trials. It was a decision that would haunt the minister the rest of his life. The day after Fast Day in 1697, Cotton confided in his diary that being afflicted last night with discouraging thoughts, as if unavoidable marks of the divine displeasure must overtake my family, for not appearing with vigour enough to stop the proceeding of the judges, when the inextricable storm from the invisible world assaulted the country. The witch trials and their aftermath did not end Puritanism in New England. However, it did seal its fate by banning all publications except for Cotton Mather's. The Mathers and Phipps gave both contemporary and future enemies of the Puritans a club with which to beat them. Khalif may have tied a tin can on Cotton Mather, but Mather handed him the can in the first place. Perry Miller summed up the aftermath of the witch trials, the tract wars, the Mathers' fall from power, Increase's removal from Harvard, and the establishment of the Brattle Street Church as nothing less than the explosion into fragments of the once proudly unified New England society. It could portend nothing less than that America was about to become hell on earth. And that's the next part of our Salem Witch Trials. Sheesh, interesting indeed. When we come back, we are actually going to what is known as Salem's End. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.